Thank you everyone for coming to the launch of the Democracy Agenda for the 48th Parliament. My name is Bill Brown. I'm Director for Clark, Helen Haynes, Independent Member for Indi, Zali Steggall, Kate Cheney, Zoe Daniel, Sophie Scomps, Monique Ryan, and Kylie Tink. After we've had some introductory statements, of course, we'll be open for questions as well. The Australia Institute's Democracy Agenda for the 48th Parliament contains 13 reform proposals to improve the quality of Australian democracy and parliamentary debate. Among the proposals are those that would make Parliament work better, allow for a greater diversity of debate, views and votes to be heard, and provide for the staffing allocations for members of Parliament and senators to be set independently rather than being a gift of the Prime Minister. Then there are 10 reform proposals to improve the quality of government and democracy, including truth in political advertising laws, a whistleblower protection authority, improving the National Anti-Corruption Commission and allowing it to hold public hearings whenever they are in the public interest, and cleaning up the lobbyist register and ministerial diaries being disclosed. This is the Australia Institute's second democracy agenda after the agenda for the 47th Parliament. And I'm delighted to say that many of the reforms proposed in the original agenda were pursued and indeed adopted during the course of this term of Parliament by the Albanese government and the 47th Parliament of Australia. There are many things to improve about Australian democracy, but also a lot to be proud of in how our country operates and does things. And while no party or group has a monopoly on democratic or parliamentary reform, it's also the case that those on the crossbench, including Community Independents and Greens, have shown a special interest in parliamentary and democratic reform. That's why the Australia Institute is so delighted to be joined by crossbenchers to help launch the democracy agenda.
Well, thank you, Bill, and the Australia Institute for mapping out a blueprint of what is possible. Can the Parliament decide to come together and take action to improve our democracy, to shine sunlight into dark places, and to take the bold actions that the status quo love to run and hide from? It's no surprise that the crossbench are standing here with this piece of work, with this detailed blueprint for what we could do in the 48th Parliament. But forget not one of us is guaranteed to be standing here again in the 48th Parliament. We're about to have an election. And what we've just witnessed in the House of Representatives and in the Senate is so-called electoral reform. It's the major parties, I think, rather cynical attempt to undertake democratic reform. You'll make your own judgments about that, but the strength of the crossbench is only as strong as the nation's democracy. We want to see reforms to transparency and integrity in our democratic system, and most certainly in the halls of this Parliament. I will be fighting to see the National Anti-Corruption Commission fulfil the ambition that I had for it coming into this Parliament. I was very happy to see it legislated, but I have some concerns about how it's fulfilling its function, and I will be fighting to restore what was originally in the legislation, and that was to hold public hearings when in the public interest. And we saw in this Parliament the two major parties coming together on a last-minute change to what was extremely strong legislation to do a deal on the exceptional circumstances clause to make sure that we almost will never see a public hearing in the National Anti-Corruption Commission. So this document spells out again how we strengthen our democracy, how we make sure that promises given are promises fulfilled. Similarly, we haven't seen the reforms that we want to see collectively around whistleblower reform, particularly the establishment of a whistleblower protection authority. If I'm privileged enough to be back here, I'll be continuing to fight for that reform, because we know that the brave people who stand up against a tidal wave of difficulty in order to report corruption are the ones that in fact suffer for doing so. Again, I want to thank the Australia Institute, my colleagues, and everyone in Australia who wants to see a stronger democracy, who wants to see transparency, ethics, good governance and accountability in the Australian Parliament. Think very carefully about how you vote this election.
13th of February 2025 will go down in history as the day the two major parties undermined our democracy to entrench their own power. Absolutely, a vibrant crossbench is fundamental to holding governments to account. They have just passed laws by gagging debate to ensure that that accountability may not be there in the future. Australians should be very worried about our democracy because the major parties have just done a stitch-up deal to allow themselves to entrench their own power. Be worried.
Well, it's the last day of school and time to give the government its report card on transparency and integrity, and I'm giving it a fail, sadly. We still do not have any effective whistleblower protections in this country for both the public and private sector, and the promise at the last election of such reform being delivered has not occurred. We still do not have any effective media freedom laws. The National Anti-Corruption Commission, which is good at face value, did stumble at the first hurdle on the outcome or the inquiry into robo-debt, and it still needs to be improved in other ways, for example, to have public hearings. And then today, as Sophie has so well explained, the major parties have done a grubby deal behind closed doors to try and entrench their position and to hold back the wave or the tide of independence and minor and micro parties. So it's a fail for this government in this term on integrity and transparency, which makes the Australia Institute's report today so much more important, because in the next Parliament there is so much to do, so much for us on the crossbench to push for and to achieve and to hold the next government to account. And if it is indeed a power-sharing Parliament, so many opportunities for the crossbench to actually achieve those reforms. So we'll have different views on all of the recommendations of the Australia Institute report, but collectively it's a good report and it's a good blueprint for the next Parliament.
Democracy is in trouble all over the world, and it is precious and it is fragile. And globally, we're seeing that people are losing trust that their governments are making decisions in the public interest. Instead, it looks like decisions are being made for vested interests. And the same things are happening here in Australia, and we've seen an example of that in the Senate last night and the House this morning, with debate gagged on laws that will change who can get into Parliament. It is so important that we have strong civil society organisations such as the Australia Institute and contributions like this that help us improve our democracy and continue to evolve it to try to regain that trust. So we need these contributions and reports like this. We also need a crossbench who's there looking at improving the system rather than thinking about winning government. And we need to keep being vigilant and making these improvements and fighting the vested interests so that we can rebuild trust and have the sort of democracy that we want to have here in Australia.
I'm in a slightly unique situation on the crossbench in that I know my seat won't be here next year. So I say this as someone who truly believes in the premises of our democracy. Our democracy does not belong to the major parties. Yet we have seen over the term of this Parliament a concerted effort for the two parties to collaborate time and time again to stop any true reform that lets real Australians back into this place. This report on integrity and how we can do it better, this is what Australians should be aspiring for as we come into the 2025 election, because all of us are made stronger when our democracy is accessible to each of us. We send people here to represent us, not the major parties, but the major parties don't like that we've woken up to that opportunity. Australians, stand up for your vote. Vote the way that you believe is going to bring truth and integrity back to this place. And right now, I can tell you your vote is wasted if you cast it with either the Labor Party or the Liberal National Coalition.
This is a fantastic report from the Australian Institute with very important recommendations. It's clear integrity and transparency is not something either the Labor Party or the Coalition welcome or embrace. They will do everything they can to maintain power. For them, politics is about power. For us, politics is about people, about policy, about community. There is a fundamental difference. We can all disagree on issues, on the merit. The process is important. What we've had today, for example, has been a gag on debate. People who normally would call out gags, member for Mayo, members of the Labor Party, who will talk a big game on no gags, have supported gagging, one of the most broad-ranging change to our electoral reform that we've had in many, many years. It will fundamentally impact the choice Australians have at the 2028 election if it is not amended. As far as I'm concerned, this legislation must be independently reviewed, and anyone wishing to form government must commit to implementing the changes independently recommended to ensure this is an equitable, democratic piece of reform around donation and around electoral issues. Of course, I've been many times in this place talking about truth in political advertising. The stinger in the tail about this latest dirty deal between Labor and the Coalition is that they're going to pay themselves more money from the public purse to keep lying to you, because they have still not passed truth in political advertising laws. The promises from Minister Farrell that that was a priority, that we need to cut out misinformation and lies, have gone nowhere, because what he was more interested in doing is a dirty deal with the Coalition. This report highlights the importance of truth in political advertising. Why are we valuing a consumer vote, a consumer right, more than our voting rights? We protect consumers from scam. We have scam legislation going through the House now, but yet we have no legislation to protect voters from political scams, and that has to stop.
This is a great report from the Australian Institute, and I agree with the vast majority of the recommendations in it. But I can tell you that not one of them will happen if the two major parties are in control of that. The only ones who are going to prosecute these integrity, rigour, transparency measures are your independents on the crossbench. Out of adversity, I think, comes opportunity too. And I say to the Australian voting public, today could be the day democracy died. But you have a choice. We do what you ask us to do. Your community independents represent you in this place. The two major parties, as I've shown today, are only interested in themselves. So there's an election coming and you have a choice at the ballot box. What kind of country do you want in the global environment that we have? When you get to that voting booth, think very carefully about what happened in this place today.
One of the safest seats in the country. Both sides, if they're looking for culture or they need support in a home parliament, will look to you. How important is this to be on the table if they want your support?
I'll pull you up on the term safe seat. I genuinely don't think there's a safe seat left in the country. I went from 0 to 51% at one election, like many of my colleagues, so I'm not taking it for granted. Look, I think I can speak for all of my colleagues here today, I hope they don't mind, and say that greater integrity and transparency in governance in this country is a top priority for us all. And I think we would all look for every opportunity in the next parliament to progress a range of things. It would be fabulous to wind back today's legislation. That would be a good thing for the country. But as we've all spoken to a range of different points, I think between us, we want everything from whistleblower protection, media freedom law, a stronger National Anti-Corruption Commission, effective political donation and expenditure reform, truth in political advertising. There are so many pieces to this jigsaw. That was a long-winded way of saying I reckon we're all going to go for it in the next term and give it our very best shot.
I reckon that's all in favour. Say aye. Aye.
To follow that point, though, there does seem to be a what happened last night. Either way.
I think certainly I only speak for myself here. This is a blow to the trust that we have with this government. I've been trying to engage in good faith for a couple of years on this reform, and it gets pushed through in possibly on the last day. So that does undermine trust. I'm also a pragmatist, and I will work with everyone across the House. I recognise we have differences and we have things in common, and you have to be pragmatic. And I think that's what people expect in my community, expect from me, and Australians expect their leaders to work it out and get on with it and deal with the big issues that matter. So I'll take a pragmatic approach into that, but it is absolutely true that this is a blow to the trust, really with both major parties, but the government's in control here, and that will affect how we work going forward.
Question from me. One of the challenges here is achieving parity in terms of funding, achieving parity in terms of Bill, if you wouldn't mind addressing it. How do you achieve that in the context of parties that are collecting what would the perfect situation in terms of parity look like?
The Australia Institute 2 years ago identified 9 principles for fair political finance reform. That includes both treating different participants equally, so both incumbents and new entrants, party candidates and independent candidates, but also making sure that reform is effective and targeted. Based on those principles, we outline, both in this paper and in others, a number of reforms that would help make things fairer. We could have a public funding system modelled on the democracy voucher system used in the city of Seattle, which allows new entrants to access public funding. Currently, you get your public funding after the election when it's not usable. So that rules out new entrants. But it's also a case that effective transparency and regulation would shine a light on payments that we are not going to see under the Labor-Liberal deal that's passed Parliament today. Moving the disclosure threshold from $1,000 to $5,000 excludes the cash for access payments that we know go to ministers. In our reform proposals, we acknowledge that there are privacy concerns with revealing all political donors. And we said if you raised the threshold to $5,000, you should set the threshold at $0 for certain types of payments. Those coming from corporations, which have no privacy rights, and those coming for the purpose of cash for access, which the people are entitled to know about. We saw with caps and disclosure thresholds in Victoria that the parties lowered their cost of access to get beneath them. And that's why a $0 threshold would address that problem.
Can I add? I identified in my interim comments to the report 2 years ago, nearly, that there are 13 party advantages and 5 incumbency advantages that need to be addressed in any donation and spending caps framework. Now, those have not been addressed. And the reality is this is really complicated, which is why our number one ask has been send it to a committee, get an independent group to analyse this so that we understand its impact. I'm open to finding a way to do caps if it's possible to address those advantages, but the total lack of scrutiny and the refusal to put this out for public comment and do an inquiry on it is a really good sign that the major parties know it would not stand up to public scrutiny. So we need to look at that. I'm absolutely open to good faith discussions about how to create a level playing field. All we know is what's been put up absolutely doesn't create a level playing field. It makes it worse and it embeds the status quo.
So, just to say one thing, we're in a cost of living crisis, a housing crisis, an education crisis, and a climate crisis. And on what is almost certainly the last day of this parliament, what we've seen is the two major parties colluding to stitch up their own electoral prospects for the 2028 election. That's what they're thinking about. This reform that we've just voted on will not affect the current election, but the Labor Party knows that it might lose this election, and so it's trying to protect its arse in 2028. That's all this is about. All we're asking is for an independent assessment of the legislation and its values and its downfalls.
Many of the parliamentarians legal challenges,
There's no doubt that there'll be a legal challenge, and I think that needs to run its course to see whether these laws are unconstitutional. But whether or not they're unconstitutional, they are against the interests of the Australian public. So that will be what we're focusing on while the legal system does its job. And any Australian who wants to have choice in how they're represented in the future should be very concerned about this. And if Australians are not concerned about this, the major parties will rely on the complacency, push it through, and protect their incumbency, which is why we are so upset about this and think it's a really big deal for Australian democracy.
Just on that point, I would certainly welcome for this legislation to be challenged to the High Court as to whether or not it is constitutional. We don't have the means. We are independents. We don't have the capacity to do that. But I think the Australian people deserve to have this legislation tested, because it very well may be that this 2025 election is the last election where there is genuine choice at the ballot box. Because after that, if this legislation stands as it is, my strong impression is that it will very much embed incumbent and major party advantage and make it very difficult to challenge, which means you have less choice, you have less exchange of ideas. As we're seeing around the world, the lack of choice and options leads to poor leadership choices. And that is problematic when we face many, many challenges, as Monique just raised. So from my point of view, I am incredibly concerned. They have provided themselves a 47% increase on the payment per vote. I mean, stop and pause for a minute to think about that. The claims about taking big money out of politics are completely negated by the fact that all they're doing is making sure the big money comes from the public purse to come and support their operations. It is a farce to say that this is about taking money out of politics or strengthening democracy. And while they gag the debate, if they're so sure this legislation passes the pub test, have a debate, have an inquiry, show that you have some integrity in actually having this tested. Not a single Labor MP, if you are in seats with Labor MPs, ask your MP, did you speak on this legislation? Where is your speech? What did you say? Why do you justify this as being good legislation? Not a single MP had the nerve, beyond the ministers, had the nerve to stand up for this legislation.
I just ask you been involved? I know Zali's spoken to this, I know Kate's spoken to this, but regarding negotiations and minority
Yeah.
what's happened. Kate, you said it was a blow to negotiate with Zali this morning. Well, it would really colour your perspective is that for some time work. I just want to be clear with you. What does this do?
I will look for every. I'll look for every. I'll start again. I'll look for every opportunity in the next parliament to progress greater integrity and transparency. I will look for every opportunity to have these political donation and expenditure changes today overturned. But I'll also be looking for a range of other integrity and transparency measures like media freedom laws, greater whistleblower protections, improvements to the National Anti-Corruption Commission, truth in political advertising, and so on. But I want to make one thing perfectly clear, though, as far as my negotiations with a future government. Unlike what I did in 2010, if I am re-elected at the forthcoming federal election, this time around I will not enter into a formal deal with the next government for my support for supply and confidence. And instead, I will approach every single vote on its merits, including possibly on day one, a vote of confidence in the government. So that's where I'm going should I be re-elected. And I'm doing that because I learned back in 2010, 2013, that when you have a formal deal, you are to some degree locked in and you lose your freedom of manoeuvre, we would have called it when I was back in the army. Even if the contract only goes so far as confidence and supply, the fact is you've gone into the government's tent, you're starting to drink their Kool-Aid, and you start to become almost a part of the team. Whereas in the second half of my first term, when I didn't have that agreement, I felt that I was entirely a free agent and much more effective in the parliament.
Just maybe that point, some, I'm not sure at the lodge, I won't ask you more to discuss, but is that a bit of a bait and switch to pass these laws this week? Why did you lodge?
No. We've known this is coming. You really have to be hiding under your desk if you didn't think that this piece of so-called electoral reform wasn't going to get rammed through both houses of the parliament as the government comes chain-stoking to an election. So I think that many people underestimate what the crossbench sees in this parliament. And can I tell you that we are very clear-eyed about how the major parties operate, and the moment we saw the Labor Party, National Party, Liberal Party coalition, that other secret deal that happens in this parliament, get their heads together to fine-tune electoral reform, we knew exactly what would happen. And we've seen it happen before. And I think every time you see arch enemies, as the government and the opposition are on just about everything, when you see them chumming up on what they see as nation-building reform, then you have cause to understand that something is going on. So no, very clear-eyed from the crossbench when we received an invitation to the Prime Minister's drinks, and no surprise over here at what transpired. Yeah, well, I've had 2 terms under my belt, and I've had the opportunity to work with a Liberal national government and an opportunity to work with the Labor government. So I see them both, and I have also observed keenly what happened during the period of time where Mr. Wilkie and other members of the crossbench were in a balance of power situation. And let's just say I've learned something from that observation, and my stance has been the same from the day I put my hand up to run for Indi in 2019, when I was peppered with questions about what would I do in such a situation. I will never sell my vote. Every negotiation is on the table if you work with the legislation that's before you. So signing deals with either major party takes away the most useful tool that I have, and that's to sit down with whoever minister is trying to pursue a piece of legislation and make it better. And indeed, one of the opportunities that a crossbench re-elected to the 48th Parliament would have in a balance of power situation is to work with the standing orders and make sure that private members' bills get a run in this Parliament, and then we truly see reform on key democratic reforms such as what the Australia Institute are talking about today.
One of the points that the Australian Institute is calling for is truth in political advertising, and I've certainly been calling for it. In the absence of political will by the government and the opposition, I'm launching the Ethical Political Advertising Code, which is a pledge by me, and it will carry that mark on my advertising. that my claims will be in the code principles, that the claims will be accurate, not misleading or deceptive. 2, that they will be precise and substantiated. All claims must be supported by valid, reliable and precise evidence. And 3, that they be credible. Ads must only use genuine and accurate endorsements and will not use deep fakes or AI. I'll be writing to my colleagues in the Parliament, to the Leader of the Opposition, to the Prime Minister, to the Leader of the Greens and my colleagues on the crossbench to commit to this code, because the Australian public should know the absence of commitment to this code means they want to keep open the loophole to lie to you.
AJ Brown, Chair of Transparency International Australia and Professor of Public Policy and Law at Griffith University. As a very quick segue, I'd just like to lend Transparency International Australia's support for the suite of reforms that's in the Australia Institute's package for the 48th Parliament. Many of you will be aware that as of yesterday, with the release of this year's Corruption Perceptions Index by Transparency International, which shows the reward that comes with meaningful reform, that we've also identified our key priorities for an integrity pack, and many of them have been mentioned and many of them are complementary. But one of them, to really, I guess, endorse the significance of what Zali Steggall is saying, is the really important component of making sure that we do concrete things to address misinformation and disinformation in political communication. I think it's really, really important. It points to the long-term commitment that MPs need to have. Zali Steggall was elected 2 elections ago, really putting this problem on the front foot on the agenda for reform. And it is a sign of the continuing challenges and a real worry that we have not been able to make substantial progress in getting a regulatory framework that means that misleading and deceptive conduct in political campaigning and political communication doesn't have any legal dress or enforcement or control mechanism at all. So I think in the absence of that, the code here helps keep this issue at least somewhere high on the agenda, because we're not going to be able to escape it. It's a worldwide problem and we have to address it. And truth in politics matters. Honesty in politics matters. Wouldn't it be a great thing if at the very least every candidate signed on to a set of principles that affirmed that they weren't going to leave it to chance, that they weren't going to either accidentally, let alone deliberately, manipulate information in a way that will continue to impact on and erode the trust of citizens and the public. So it's a big thank you to Zali Steggall and other MPs in the Parliament, but particularly to Zali for burning, keeping this particular fire burning, because it's something which is a burning platform for democracy worldwide, unless and until we address it. So at the very least, this is something that every candidate can do to help push things in the right direction until and alongside getting eventually that really much more meaningful reform.
Thank you. I believe you have your next press conference here. Thank you.